First World War started on the 28th of July 1914, and many people thought that the war would actually be over before Christmas. But as we all know, it sadly lasted until November the 11th, 1918, and by the end of World War I there was 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. But today's story takes place only 5 months into the war, as Christmas Day approached. The war was still in its early days, but still an unimaginable number of lives had already been taken. Our story takes place on the Western Front, where trench warfare had started not long ago. On one side you had the British dug into their trenches, and on the other side you had the Germans dug into theirs. And in between there was no man's land, where many soldiers met their end in the mud and barbed wire, being riddled with bullets. When the trenches had first been dug out, the soldiers were in good spirits, the weather had been kind and the trenches were dry as a bone. However, this didn't last long, as the harsher months approached, bringing with them the harsher weather, mainly cold and rain, and the rain was relentless, filling up the trenches with brown yellow clay coloured waters. The soldiers on both sides were now living in a horrendous mud-filled hole. Watery thick clay was all around. Think of it like sinking sand. Many soldiers became stuck and found it difficult to get out, and on some occasions when the walls of the trench would fall in on the soldiers, they would find it difficult to get out in the wet mud and would drown right there in their own trench amongst the rats. But despite how horrendous this all sounded, the trench was actually the safest spot they could be in. If anyone tried to get out of their trench, they would be shot by snipers on the other side, who were sometimes only about 50 yards away in their trenches across no man's land, where machine gun fire was also constant. Both sides lived this way in these horrendous conditions for quite some time, until one day the rain stopped, only to be replaced by the bitter bite of winter, the frost. Christmas was approaching fast. Meanwhile in Rome, the Pope was desperately trying to achieve a ceasefire on Christmas Day, in hopes that all sides could celebrate the holy day and hopefully make everyone reevaluate just why they fought in this war, and hopefully a permanent ceasefire would follow that would end the war. However, leaders on all sides of the war all refused there would be no peace this Christmas. It would seem war had no place for a truce, even a brief one. Back on the Western Front, the waters had receded and the muddy clay turned into a frozen solid state as icy frost and snow covered the ground and fell into the trenches. The men knew that no ceasefire had been agreed upon, and to disobey a direct order was considered treason. Life for both the English and the Germans were tough in the trenches. Both sides would have been missing their loved ones, especially at this time of the year, and in an attempt to boost morale, both sides received a number of gifts. The soldiers received gifts such as cigars, pipes, tobacco, sweets, Christmas cards, not to mention gifts sent from family members sending personal packages, all in an attempt to boost morale on these harsh cold days and nights, at a bleak time when these soldiers didn't know whether today would be their last. You see, both sides constantly lived in fear whether today would be the day that the enemy would attack. There would be days when orders were given for them to venture out into no man's land and meet the enemy head on, and obviously not everyone would return. And every now and again a lucky shot from an enemy sniper would take away someone's best friend. As you can imagine, to say that the English didn't think very fondly of the Germans and the Germans didn't think very fondly of the English would have been quite an understatement. Christmas Eve morning had arrived, and the Germans had planted small fir trees which they decorated with candles and positioned them all along the edges of the trenches. All of these beautiful little trees twinkled out across no man's land, illuminating the frozen snowy ground. When the sun had gone down, some of the British soldiers appeared out from their trench, and what they saw really must have been a glorious sight, at a time when a little Christmas spirit was really needed. At first sight, some of the British soldiers weren't sure what they were looking at and feared an attack. And then it dawned on them, they were actually looking at little Christmas trees. At some point in the night, as the British sat at their posts in their trenches, all of a sudden they heard Christmas carols being sung by the Germans. Although not being sung in their language, the British knew straight away what they were listening to. The Germans were singing Stille Nacht, the German version of Silent Night. And what else could the British do but sit there and listen? Once the Germans had finished singing their Christmas carol, the British decided to sing some of their own. Each side would start taking the turn singing Christmas carols, and at first it was as if they were trying to outdo each other, and then something amazing happened. Now this quote I'm going to read you is actually from one of the British soldiers in the trenches at this time. First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up O Come All Ye Faithful, the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles, and I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations singing the same carol in the middle of a war. And so it would seem that a German and English choir was formed as they sang to each other over no man's land. They sang carols together for most of the night, and then eventually when the last carol ended, one of the Germans shouted out from his trench. The German shouted, "Come over, Tommy." This was a nickname that the Germans had chosen for the British. And then something amazing happened. A solitary figure ascended nervously from his trench, his place of safety, and bravely made his way across the artillery-torn barbed wire hell that was no man's land, where soldiers from both sides lay dead where they fell. And in the middle, an English officer and a German officer met, shook hands, and shared a drink of whiskey. They came to an agreement: if you don't shoot, we don't shoot. And right there on that certain spot on the Western Front, the truce was agreed upon. On Christmas Day, it was understood that there would be an unofficial ceasefire. The next morning the sun rose on Christmas Day. It was a cold sunny day, and the sun shined on the thin blanket of snow that dusted the ground. Once the British awoke, they were shocked to see the Germans walking around out of their trenches. Such a thing would simply have been considered suicide on any other day. Somewhat reassured by this, the British did the same. Once out of the trenches, soldiers from both sides who had been trapped in their own trenches for so long saw the true horror of war. All around them, dead bodies of each side's soldiers lay on the frozen ground. Now of course both sides knew that these dead bodies had been there all along, but to actually see them in broad daylight from outside of the trench would have been a horrific sight. So both sides walked amongst each other, collecting their dead, and dug graves in the frozen ground, and both sides showed their respect for one another's dead and held joint services. Slowly, the Germans all come up from the safety of their camp, and so did the British, and they met in the middle of no man's land, and exchanged handshakes and kind words and smiles, and even started to exchange Christmas presents with each other, exchanging alcohol, plum puddings, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and they actually tried on each other's uniforms, which I believe has actually been captured in some very old photographs from that day. One English soldier even asked a German soldier if he could take a button off his coat, and the German soldier happily obliged. More and more parts of the Western Front saw what was happening and followed suit, nervous at first, but eventually they started to relax and fraternise with the supposed enemy. And one German barber even offered haircuts to the British soldiers. Spirits were high that Christmas Day. They laughed, they joked, they admired, and they both showed their sadness that they were even a part of this war. There was even a story of a British and a German soldier having a conversation about why they were fighting in the war. The German replied that he is fighting for freedom for his country. The British soldier replied, "How can that be? For I am fighting for freedom for my country." It was seen both men were fighting for the same thing, and no thoughts of laying a claim on one another's homes came into it. The German soldier believed that God was on his side, whereas the British soldier believed that God was on his side. The Germans and the British spent all of Christmas Day together, and even broke out a football and had a friendly match. But sadly this couldn't last, it just couldn't be. And as Christmas Day came to an end, both soldiers from both sides shook hands and parted ways with a newfound admiration and respect, knowing that the next time they meet, it wouldn't be on such good terms and blood would be spilt. According to the stories, the truce lasted a couple of days after Christmas going into the new year. As you can imagine, it had probably become quite hard for both sides to actually open fire on each other from this day on. And then words of the unofficial ceasefire got to the generals, and strict orders were sent down. The orders were that there would be no more fraternising with the enemy. It would seem some sides were ordered to open fire on the enemy to break the state of mind the men were in. And the Germans were even told that if they showed any compassion in any way for the enemy, then they would be considered enemies and shot dead. So as we all know, the war did go on, but for one brief moment on Christmas Day, mortal enemies met in a field of pointless death and destruction and showed feelings of fondness, respect and admiration, brought together because of the Christmas spirit and the humanity that we all have inside of us.
When you think of Christmas, you think of joy and you think of laughter. You think of the season of goodwill, warmth and love. You also think of the jolly fat man himself, Santa Claus, who is a personification of all the above. But did you know that there is another character who also shares the Christmas period with Santa Claus? And he's not interested in love or laughter, joy, the season of goodwill. He's interested in cruelty and punishment. And his name is the Krampus. Now, as I said, his name is Krampus, and over the years he has had many different image variations. But what I'm going to tell you now seems to be the most common characteristics of the Christmas demon. Krampus is said to be a very large half-goat, half-demon humanoid figure, and he's covered from head to toe in thick hair, which tends to be either brown or black. And he's also said to walk on one cloven hoof on one leg and a bird's claw on the other. On his head are two very large curling horns which point up to the winter sky. His face is said to be a horror to behold. He has eyes that bulge from their sockets, and very sharp razor fangs, with a long lolling tongue which dangles down from his grotesque mouth. He also carries with him very long heavy chains, which are said to represent the binding of the devil by the Christian Church. And it is said that he uses these chains to thrash about and scare and intimidate his victims and bind them. And hanging from the chains are very small bells, which are said to have a distinct chime and terrify his victims as he approaches. He also carries with him bundles of birch branches, which he uses to strike and whip naughty children. He also carries a basket upon his back, a little bit like Santa's sack, but this basket is not filled with toys. You see, he uses this basket to carry away naughty children who will then either be eaten, drowned, or simply taken to hell. Now, the Krampus' origin story actually goes way back in history, long before Christianity. His origin story actually starts in Germany, long before he was ever associated with Christmas. In Germanic paganism, he was named Krampen, which translates into claw. Now, St. Nicholas would go around giving out gifts to all the good children whilst they slept. Krampus would follow, but he would be looking for the naughty children, and when he found them, he would pick them up, put them in his basket and take them away, or if they were lucky, he would simply whip them with the birch wood. But I would say recently the tradition of Krampus has started to become more and more popular each year. Now, people seem to love the lore of the Christmas demon, which seems to bring down a certain darkness upon the tradition that we have all grown to love and cherish over the years. And it will probably surprise you to know that there are also many festivals held all around the world where the locals will dress up as a Christmas demon and go around actually scaring children and intimidating adults, which is all in the name of fun, and the crowds will often reward them with shots of schnapps. Now, you've probably noticed that Krampus is also turning up in popular pop culture. There are films being made of the Krampus, and he also turns up on the odd occasional Christmas card. But this is one dark folklore tale I will not be introducing into my home this Christmas. So try and remember, on this 24th of December as Santa makes his rounds, he will also be followed by the Christmas demon. So try and be good this Christmas, and maybe you will be spared a visit from the Krampus.
Down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes how they twinkled, his dimples how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that he shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and the twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings and turned with a jerk. And laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim as he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
Merry Christmas!
Now I'm sure I didn't do that poem any justice, but I'm sure you recognise the very famous words from the very famous poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, what is more commonly known as Was the Night Before Christmas, which was written by Clement Clarke Moore in 1823. It was from this poem we were given the beloved conception of Santa Claus that we all now know and love. The poem also gave us Santa's flying companions which have pulled his sleigh ever since. Right, let's see if I can remember all of the 8 reindeer. Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, Blitzen. And if you thought I forgot all about poor old Rudolph, he came much later when a department store created him in 1939 to sell books. This is a version of Santa Claus that we have all come to know and love. The jolly fat man dressed in red who goes around the world in one night delivering presents to every boy and girl. But did you know Santa's origin goes back way before this poem was ever written? Hundreds of years before, in fact. And it's not quite as festive as you might think. The first accounts of Santa Claus date back to 280 AD in Patara near Myra in modern-day Turkey, where a monk named St. Nicholas became admired for his great kindness. It is noted in history that St. Nicholas was born into a wealthy family. When his parents died, he inherited all the fortune. But St. Nicholas chose to give all his fortune away and decided to live a life travelling around the countryside, helping the poor, the sick and the needy. Many stories were written about the kindness of St. Nicholas, but here are a few of the best known. The story goes that St. Nicholas saved 3 sisters from being placed into prostitution by their father, who was finding it hard to put food on the table, and for some reason thought this was the best way to raise money. St. Nicholas decided to help by visiting the home of the father and the 3 daughters late at night and throwing bags of gold coin through the window and saving the family from such desperate acts. Another version of this story explains the tradition of hanging stockings from the fireplace for Santa to fill with gifts. In this version, St. Nicholas throws a bag of gold coins down the chimney and it accidentally lands in a drying stocking which is hung above the fire, thus creating the tradition that we all know and love today. Although St. Nicholas did wish for his great acts of kindness to remain secret, news soon did spread of St. Nicholas's kindness every time someone received a secret gift. Another story tells of some sailors who were caught out at sea in a dreadful storm on the coast of Turkey. The sailors prayed for St. Nicholas's help, and all of a sudden there he stood on the deck of the boat. He then turned to the raging waves of the ocean and ordered them to calm, allowing the sailors to sail safely to shore. Another tale tells of 3 travelling students who stopped off at an inn on the way to Athens. Unfortunately, the innkeeper murdered them all and placed their dismembered corpses into pickling barrels. Sometime later, St. Nicholas was also travelling past the inn and decided to make a stop. That night, as St. Nicholas slept, he had a dream of the crime that had been committed by the innkeeper. The next day when St. Nicholas awoke, he prayed to God to restore life to the 3 dead boys, and the miracle he prayed for was granted, and the 3 dead boys returned to life. An alternative version of this tale tells of 3 younger children who were murdered, instead of the 3 students, this time murdered by a butcher, rather than an innkeeper, and as before, life is once again restored to the 3 children. And from then on, St. Nicholas becomes known as the patron and protector of children. And then throughout St. Nicholas's life, other tales are told of him saving people from famine, being wrongly accused, and much, much more. Sadly, on the 6th of December 343 AD, St. Nicholas passed away in prison, after the Roman Emperor Diocletian persecuted him for his Christian faith, and Nicholas was buried in the church at Myra, where he had served as bishop. But even after his death, his reputation lived on, and many more stories of his good deeds appeared. St. Nicholas's Day has been celebrated for hundreds of years, and over time he has slowly become the fat jolly man in red we all know and love today, who somehow delivers gifts to every child in the world in one night. And St. Nicholas is not the only name he now goes by. Here are just a few: Papa Noel, Kris Kringle, Peltzer-Nickel, Santa Claus, and as we like to call him here in the UK, Father Christmas.
If I was to ask you to name an evil companion of Santa Claus, an entity who follows him around on Christmas Eve giving out brutal punishments to naughty children, your first thought would probably be Krampus, the Christmas demon, who kidnaps naughty children, whips them with birch branches, and carries them off to hell to devour them. But I've already covered the Krampus on a past Christmas episode, so whilst looking up other Christmas dark traditions and lore, I stumbled upon a character who also travels with Santa dishing out severe punishments to children, and his name is Hans Trapp, the horrifying Christmas scarecrow. The dark legend of the evil Christmas spirit Hans Trapp originates in the Alsace and Lorraine regions of France way back in the 1400s. In life, Hans Trapp was a very wealthy man with a very sinister demeanour. He was a very selfish soul and extremely greedy. No matter how much wealth he accumulated, it was never enough. He always wanted more. Hans Trapp stood at a very tall 6.5 foot, a monstrous man with wild, untamed, dark, thick hair and an uncontrollably long, thick, dark beard with two beady eyes that stared out from below his bushy eyebrows. It was said that Hans Trapp practiced the occult and had consulted with dark forces to reach his wealthy status. But Hans Trapp wanted more wealth and even more power, and he wanted more than anything to be feared. And so it is said that Hans Trapp summoned the devil himself and made a deal. Somehow the church found out about this, and it is safe to say they were furious, and they immediately placed sanctions on Hans Trapp and excommunicated him, taking his wealth and his name. Hans Trapp was exiled from his home, and so he fled into the deep dark forest, making a home for himself. And after time, insanity festered in his already troubled mind, and he became even more obsessed with satanic rituals and dark practices. As sanity slipped further and further away, and he fell even deeper into his evil and demented ways, he started to crave something else apart from power and wealth. Hans Trapp had begun to crave flesh, human flesh, and in particular, a child's flesh. He desired this more than anything. The urge was now overpowering, and one day he decided he was going to take a child. But he knew he was a terrifying sight to behold. And so Hans Trapp came up with the bizarre idea to disguise himself as a scarecrow by stuffing the sleeves of his dirty jacket with thick straw, a sack upon his face and a dirty torn hat, and he stood as still as a statue, in the middle of a field, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And he didn't have to wait long. A small boy aged 10 eventually approached, totally unaware. As the young boy walked up towards the scarecrow with not a care in the world, he thought for a second that he saw the scarecrow move, and so he stopped and stared up at the straw-filled terror. And then without warning, the scarecrow pounced upon the child and stabbed him to death with a very large sharp stick. He then flung the boy's dead body over his shoulder and headed back towards his cabin in the forest. When Hans Trapp arrived back at his cabin, he then dismembered and roasted the boy's remains. The overpowering urge to taste the boy's flesh became too much, and he cut off a slice and brought the crispy seasoned meat towards his lips. It was at this very moment that God was watching Hans Trapp, and God had decided enough was enough, and shot a bolt of lightning from the heavens, which hit Hans Trapp, killing him instantly, and setting the wooden cabin alight, burning it to the ground. But that wasn't the end for Hans Trapp. As punishment,
his spirit was reanimated as a terrifying half-man, half-scarecrow hybrid who follows behind Santa Claus as he makes the rounds on Christmas Eve. And when Santa visits the houses of naughty children, he will leave his traditional piece of coal and then leave the Christmas scarecrow to inflict his own style of punishment upon the child. Some say Hans Trapp will whip the child with birchwood and insist that the child changes their way unless they want a fate like his. This is now Hans Trapp's only chance of redemption, and his punishment is the uncontrollable urge to eat the children that he punishes, even after death. But he will never be allowed to do so as long as he travels behind St. Nicholas. And although St. Nicholas is the protector of all children, it would seem that he doesn't mind Hans Trapp dishing out his punishments from time to time to children who made it onto his naughty list. Over the many years, the legend of Hans Trapp has been passed down from generation to generation. Parents use the story to persuade their children to behave, unless they want to be visited by the Christmas Scarecrow.